The first shock hit when flight attendant Meredith stood blocking the aisle, smiling as if granting a favor, while ordering James Washington to vacate his first-class seat. Her voice was light as a feather, yet sharp as a blade. "Sir, we need you to move to economy. A very important passenger needs your seat." In that instant, the serene stillness of the first-class cabin shattered into sharp fragments. Zoe Ellis James's assistant froze with her laptop half open, her eyes widening with fury. James simply lifted his gaze with a calmness only those familiar with silent injustices could ever master. That morning, JFK Airport felt like it was swallowing the entire world. Endless lines of travelers, loud announcements echoing through the halls, the scent of freshly roasted coffee blending with the urgency of people rushing toward distant destinations. In the middle of that endless sea of motion, James Washington walked with the quiet poise of someone long accustomed to battles unseen by most. At 43, he was the CEO of TechVision Enterprises, an empire valued at $350 million, built from absolutely nothing, but none of that showed when people looked at him now. They only saw a black man in a meticulously tailored navy suit with neatly trimmed hair and a calm, composed demeanor. They saw the exterior long before they ever saw the person, and because of that, they judged him wrong. 3 hours before departure, James and Zoe were already in the first-class lounge. It was a habit, and also an invisible shield that usually softened unnecessary scrutiny. But this morning, that shield was almost useless. When James stepped toward the drink counter, the attendant looked him up and down before blurting out, "Sir, may I see your lounge access card?" A routine question on the surface, but no one ahead of him had been asked to show anything. And when he ordered a bottle of sparkling water, she handed it to Zoe instead, as if Zoe was the only one who belonged in such a space. Zoe looked at him, as if she wanted to scream on his behalf. James only gave a small, tired smile, the kind worn by those who have endured countless microaggressions. At gate 27, where flight Mike Hotel 249 was preparing to board, the real trouble began. Priority first class, boarding the announcement called. James and Zoe stepped forward, but the gate agent stepped in front of him with a tone so rude it bordered on hostile. "Sir, are you sure you are in first class?" His ticket clearly showed seat 2, a first class. The agent's screen confirmed the same. Yet she checked his identification not once, but 3 times. Meanwhile, a white businessman behind them walked straight through without a single question. James swallowed his frustration and boarded with a long breath, reminding himself that this trip mattered. He could not afford to lose focus. First class glowed with warm golden light. Wide leather seats cocooned passengers in quiet luxury. Soft background music played as people sipped champagne and tapped on laptops. Flight attendant Desiree Jackson, the only one whose eyes held genuine humanity, greeted them warmly. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Washington." Zoe exhaled in relief. At least one person saw them clearly. James settled into seat 2. A loosened his tie and prepared for the crucial meeting awaiting him the next day, a meeting that could help TechVision acquire a $75 million startup, save over 100 employees, and expand their cybersecurity network worldwide. But as he reviewed his documents, a whisper from the front of the cabin chilled him. A man, likely the first officer by his uniform, murmured to Chief Attendant Meredith Carter, "Is that James Washington?" "In 2, a Meredith whispered back. "Keep an eye on him. You know how they can be." They Those two letters hit Zoe like a hammer. Those two letters made James close his eyes for a heartbeat, swallowing the familiar sting in silence. For a brief moment, he considered standing up and walking off the plane. But he could not. Tomorrow's meeting was too important. So he stayed quiet, until he no longer could. Noise suddenly erupted at the aircraft door as boarding neared completion. A deep voice of authority thundered, "I do not care. What the system says, fix it." A silver-haired man entered with the aura of someone used to having the world bend around him. Senator William Preston, 62 years old, wrapped in expensive confidence and lifelong entitlement. Zoe muttered under her breath. "Here comes trouble." Meredith practically bowed before him. "Senator Preston, I am so sorry about the mix-up. We will fix it immediately." James kept reading, assuming it had nothing to do with him. He was wrong. A shadow stopped beside seat 2A. He looked up into Meredith's sugary smile, a smile empty as paper. "Sir, we have a very important passenger who needs a first-class seat. I was hoping you would be willing to move to economy." Zoe shot to her feet. "Why him? There are plenty of other seats." Meredith pretended not to hear. James set his documents aside and met her eyes. "I paid for this seat, and I will remain here." Her smile cracked. Senator Preston stepped forward and looked James up and down with deep confusion, as if he could not grasp how someone like James could possibly be sitting there. Then he delivered the spark that ignited the storm. "Surely whatever you are doing can be done from economy class." Zoe nearly shouted, "What did you just say?" James raised a hand to stop her. He was not angry. His voice was precise and cold. "Senator, I have business that requires this seat just as much as yours does." The cabin froze. Passengers began paying attention. First Officer Bennett stepped in with a threat disguised as protocol. "Sir, I recommend you cooperate. Interference with crew instructions can be considered disruptive, a blatant intimidation tactic, a misuse of authority, a serious mistake." Zoe lifted her phone to record. James looked up calmly. Recording is permitted before takeoff. Meredith's face drained of color. James spoke again, voice calm but razor-sharp. "Are you threatening to remove me from this flight because I refuse to give up a seat I rightfully purchased?" Silence exposed every truth. Bennett said nothing. Meredith mumbled evasively. Preston stared in disbelief that someone like James dared push back. None of them knew the truth. The man they underestimated held power beyond their imagination. James glanced around the cabin and raised his voice just enough. "Has anyone else been asked to give up their seat, or is it only the black man in first class?" Whispers exploded. A white woman murmured, "They did not ask me to move." An Asian man whispered, "This seems targeted." Meredith trembled. The system she relied on was cracking. Then James stood, slow, steady, commanding, not angry, simply certain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, the kind only a few had ever seen, the kind that carried real power. The plot twist had begun, but it was not time to reveal it yet. Not in this part. Not yet. James smiled the smile of a man who knows exactly how powerful he is, while those confronting him believe he is powerless. Meredith swallowed hard. Preston narrowed his eyes, realizing he may have made a grave mistake. Bennett instinctively stepped back, sensing danger. Zoe watched her boss like a storm about to sweep away every injustice in its path. And at that moment, James lifted his phone to his ear. His voice was low and steady, but when it echoed through the first-class cabin, it carried the weight of a man standing up for principle. "Maxwell, this is James Washington. We have a very big problem on flight Mike Hotel 249. The entire cabin fell silent. Meredith's breath hitched as she fought back tears. Bennett froze. Zoe smiled softly. They have no idea who they just messed with. From that moment on flight, Mike Hotel 249 was no longer just a flight. It became a battlefield, and James Washington had just assumed command. The soft beep from James's phone sounded like the trigger to a battle. The entire first-class cabin held its breath as he lifted the device to his ear, his voice low, but so clear that Meredith instinctively stepped back half a pace. "Maxwell. Yes, I am on Mike Hotel 249. We have a situation." In that moment, every movement inside the cabin stretched thin. Passengers who had been comfortably sinking into their leather seats now leaned forward, trying to catch every word slipping through the air. No one dared breathe too loudly. Everyone sensed it. This was the voice of a man with real authority. Meredith swallowed hard, her hands, usually steady in command, now trembling violently. First Officer Bennett tried to maintain a stiff posture, but the twitching at his temples betrayed him, as if his brain was calculating how to retreat without drawing attention. Zoe watched her boss with a mix of pride and simmering anger. She knew how much James had held inside for years, storing the weight of dozens of moments where he had been dismissed or underestimated. But today that glass container had cracked, and even though he was not shouting or raging, his icy composure was far more terrifying. "Yes. The head flight attendant and your first officer asked me to give up my seat. No. I did not mishear yes for the senator." James spoke slowly, each word landing like a nail hammered into a wooden table. The restraint in his voice carried more weight than any outburst could. Inside the cabin, it felt as though everyone was listening to a verdict waiting to fall. Meredith bit her lip until it bled. Bennett gripped his belt, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Senator Preston shifted backward, his expression cracking for the first time into something resembling fear. What they did not know was that the name Maxwell Reynolds, the man on the other end of the line, did not belong to some low-level supervisor who could be sweet-talked. He was the chief executive officer of the entire airline corporation, the ultimate superior of every single employee on the aircraft. And he was furious. James tilted his head, listening, then replied, "Yes, I will stay on the line if needed. I am not going anywhere." "I am not going anywhere" was more than a confirmation. It was a declaration, a warning, a stake driven firmly into the ground. James Washington wouldn't move, would not bow, would not retreat. He lowered the phone. The silence that followed tightened around the cabin like a noose. Meredith tried to cling to the last fragment of authority in her voice. "So if there seems to be a misunderstanding..." James did not look at her. He turned to Bennett. "You threatened to remove me from this aircraft. Would you like to repeat that again in front of everyone here?" His voice was not loud, yet the air in the cabin felt sucked dry. Bennett swallowed his hand, rising unconsciously to the rim of his hat. "I only followed procedure." "Procedure?" James raised a brow. "You asked a paying passenger with a valid seat to give it to someone without one. That is procedure." Bennett's face drained of color. A passenger, the Asian man seated in front, muttered, "He is right." A white woman across the aisle whispered, "I have never seen anything like this." Meredith turned to Bennett, panic flooding her face. "Just say something, fix this." But Bennett had nothing left to fix. James had exposed their wrongdoing, without shouting, without threats, only with an unshakable calm that stripped their excuses bare. Behind him, Zoe raised her phone. "The entire video is recorded," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. Meredith nearly collapsed. Preston tried to jump in his voice, wobbling with confusion and leftover arrogance. "Look, this is all just a misunderstanding. If I had known, James cut him off. No, Senator. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a system." He spoke slowly, letting his gaze sweep across every face, watching. "A system where people who look like you expect people who look like me to move." The final sentence was short, sharp, and cliced through the cabin like a blade. Preston went silent. Everyone did. Suddenly the aircraft door opened again. A breathless ground crew member rushed inside. "Mr. Washington, Mr. Harrison is on his way. He is running from the tarmac." Meredith's eyes widened with despair. Bennett stiffened. Preston stepped back once more. James nodded slightly. "Good." Zoe whispered, "He is running faster than firefighters." A few passengers let out nervous laughter. The atmosphere shifted from tension to anticipation to outright curiosity. Everyone knew the storm was nearing. 2 minutes later, the door swung open again. A tall man in a grey suit stepped inside, tie slightly off-center, from sprinting his breathing heavy, but his voice controlled. "Mr. Washington, I am Gregory Harrison, Vice President of Customer Relations." James stood to greet him. Zoe nodded. Meredith bowed so low she nearly hit the floor. Bennett stood frozen. His fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. Harrison did not look at them. He looked only at James' concern and respect mixing in his eyes. "The chief executive officer wants a full report. Right now. Captain Miller is standing by." Zoe murmured, "It has begun." Captain Miller, the captain of the aircraft, emerged from the cockpit. He carried the aura of true leadership with salt and pepper hair and sharp, steady eyes. He looked at James first. "Mr. Washington, I deeply apologize for any unprofessional conduct you have endured." Meredith opened her mouth, ready to interrupt. "Captain, if you would let me explain." Captain Miller raised a hand. "You do not speak unless I ask you to." Meredith fell silent instantly. Harrison scanned the cabin and announced, "The flight will be delayed. We are addressing an urgent personnel issue." Murmurs spread. Zoe sighed. This is definitely going to hit the news. A passenger whispered, "Who would have thought he was a chief executive officer?" Another added, "They picked the wrong person to mess with." Harrison and the captain moved toward Meredith and Bennett. "Miss Carter." "Mr. Bennett, you are both removed from this flight immediately." Meredith burst into tears. Bennett stepped back. All this because of one passenger. Captain Miller clenched his jaw. "He is not one passenger. He is a paying customer who followed every rule. You two did not." Harrison finished the statement with a voice sharp as a blade. "And more importantly, Mr. Washington holds 15% of our corporation's shares." The cabin froze. A white woman covered her mouth. "My goodness." The Asian man nodded decisively. I knew something was off. Zoe crossed her arms, lips curling into a victorious smirk. Plot twist. Meredith collapsed into a seat. Bennett looked hollow. Preston stood petrified. As the two were escorted off the plane, James didn't watch. He didn't need to. Not because they were unimportant, but because he knew this was not a victory of ego. It was a victory of principle. Zoe whispered, "You know, earlier, they looked at you like you were a nuisance." James replied softly, I am used to it. A simple sentence, yet heavy as a lifetime. Harrison turned back to James. Mr. Washington, we will assemble a new flight crew. It may take 45 minutes, James nodded. That is fine. But when we land in San Francisco, I want a meeting with your team. Harrison nodded rapidly. Of course, any time. Zoe smiled, tiredly but proudly. They had no idea they just woke a giant. James exhaled slowly, gazing out the window. The runway lights reflected like shards of old memories, the childhood in a rough Oakland neighborhood, his mother working night shifts as a nurse, the times he was mistaken for a janitor in his first company, the instances he was looked through as if invisible. He closed his eyes to let everything settle to keep anger from leading him. When he opened them, James whispered to himself, "Not today." Today would not be the day to bow his head. Today would not be the day to swallow injustice. Today would not be the day to let the system continue unchecked. Today was the day to change it. And he knew from this moment on that Mike Hotel 249 had become a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. The cabin lights glowed brightly, yet no one spoke loudly anymore. They had witnessed the storm. They had witnessed the quiet power. They had witnessed the moment a man underestimated stood tall and let the world correct itself. And as James settled back into his seat, placing his phone on the tray table, Zoe murmured, "You just taught them a lesson." James shook his head gently. "I do not want to teach. I want them to change." Harrison, standing nearby, heard those words and nodded slowly. And that was when the entire cabin understood this story had only just begun. The floor of the aircraft trembled slightly as the door closed for the third time. A new flight crew was being deployed, and the atmosphere in the first-class cabin slowly shifted from heavy tension into a solemn kind of silence, as if everyone present was witnessing a small but deeply significant moment in history. James Washington leaned back in his seat, his hand resting on the edge of the folding table. He did not appear triumphant or satisfied or vindictive. There was only the calm of a man who understood that the real battle was not the removal of 2 employees, but the exposure of a system that had rotted from within. Zoe sat across from him, her eyes scanning the surrounding passengers. Some looked at James with admiration, others with sympathy. Others still seemed unsure, as if they were still processing the true meaning of what they had just witnessed. "Are you all right?" Zoe asked softly. James nodded, though in his eyes there was a heaviness, a deep and somber reflection. The sound of footsteps approached. Marcus Reynolds, the new cabin lead, appeared with steady confidence and impeccable professionalism. He bowed his head slightly toward James. "Mr. Washington, I will be your cabin lead for the remainder of this flight. My team and I want to make sure we do right by you." It was not flattery, not an attempt to curry favor. It was simple respect, the kind James had spent too many years fighting to receive. "Thank you, James," replied, his voice gentle but firm. Marcus continued, Many of us in this airline, we are tired of things like what happened earlier, but no one dares speak up." Zoe tilted her head. "What about you?" Marcus sighed. "I do speak up, but my words do not carry the weight of the truth they just watched happen to you." He walked off to prepare the pre-departure beverages. James watched him leave a weight falling into his chest. There were too many people like Marcus in this world, people who thought correctly, but did not have the power to correct what was wrong. Today that changed. The cabin gradually settled as passengers were served water. Soft murmurs spread beneath the surface like an underground current. I did not expect him to be a chief executive officer, and he owns 15% of the airline. My goodness, the first officer is probably finished. This will definitely be in the news. Finally, an elderly woman with silver hair and graceful poise stood up and walked toward James. Zoe tensed, leaning forward slightly, but James raised a hand to signal she did not need to worry. The woman rested a hand on the side of his seat and spoke with a trembling but sincere voice. "Thank you." James blinked in surprise. For what her voice broke. For doing what my husband never dared to do. The cabin fell into silence again, but this time it was emotional, heavy with something unspoken. He was asked to leave his first-class seat 3 times in his life. Every time he said he just wanted to keep the peace, but I know it chipped away at him bit by bit. She tried to smile, but her lips quivered. "You stood up today, and somehow it feels like he has been vindicated." James gently placed his hand over hers. "No one deserves to feel that way, Mom." "Not ever." She nodded and returned to her seat, her eyes shimmering. Zoe whispered, "See, it was never just you." James did not respond. He simply gazed out the window where the sky stretched into an endless blue ribbon. 10 minutes later, Gregory Harrison, the Vice President of Customer Relations, returned. Not hurried, not flustered, not panicked like before. But in his eyes was the solemnity of a man who knew he was about to listen more than he spoke. "Mr. Washington," he began, "we are preparing the report for the Chief Executive Officer. But before we send it, I want to hear your personal thoughts." James looked over at Zoe. She nodded. This was the moment for him to voice what he had carried for years, watching injustice unfold. James spoke slowly, each word placed with deliberate weight. "The problem is not Meredith or Bennett. The problem is that they believed they could do what they did, and fear nothing." Harrison held his breath. James continued, "That is culture, and culture does not change by firing a few people." A heavy exhale came from someone nearby. A few passengers nodded, as if he had spoken their own buried thoughts. Zoe added her tone cold as steel. "If he had not called your chief executive officer, those two would have thrown him off this plane. Everything would have ended before it even began." Harrison nodded vigorously. "We acknowledge that." James looked straight into his eyes. In that moment, all softness vanished from the deep walnut-colored gaze. "Do you actually want real change?" Harrison did not blink. "Yes." James nodded once. "Then start here." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. It was not the meeting documents for tomorrow, but a set of plans from TechVision titled DEI Cultural Reform Framework. Zoe whispered, "The plan for emergency use." And today is the emergency. James placed the stack on the table. It was heavy, not because of the paper, but because of its meaning. "This," he said, "is how you fix a system, not just a shift." Harrison picked it up, his hands trembling. He had weathered many crises in his career, but never had a passenger handed him the blueprint for reforming his own airline. The entire cabin looked around, stunned by what they were witnessing. About 20 minutes later, when the plane had reached cruising altitude, and sunlight swept softly across the windows like golden silk, James finally exhaled after the long conversation. Zoe leaned closer. "You know what I find interesting?" James raised a brow. "The moment they thought you were just a black passenger who happened to sit in first class, they dismissed you. But the moment they realized you owned 15% of the airline, they were afraid." James stared at the back of the seat in front of him, his eyes deep and distant. "That is exactly what I want to fix." Zoe was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you tired?" James offered a faint smile. "I am used to it, but that does not mean I accept it." A soft knock followed. It was Desiree, the first flight attendant, who had treated James with kindness when he boarded. She bowed slightly and spoke in a low voice. "Mr. Washington, I just wanted to say thank you." Zoe tilted her head. "Thank you for what Desiree set down the tray of water and leaned in. For today you spoke for us." She handed him a folded piece of paper. James opened it. It was a list of other discriminatory incidents with dates, witnesses, and complainants. "We reported them, but no one listened." Desiree said, her voice shaking. James folded the paper and pressed it to his chest. "Do not worry. This time I will make sure they listen." Desiree nodded and stepped back. Before leaving, she turned and whispered, "My father was once removed from a flight just like you were. You gave him justice today." James did not speak. He placed both hands over his face and breathed deeply. His chest tightened not from anger, but from pain. Zoe placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes one person standing up pulls an entire generation forward. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, Senator Preston was experiencing something he had never known in his life, a cramped seat and the subtle but cutting sting of being quietly dismissed. He looked toward first class, as if staring into a different world. From his seat, he could see James calm and collected, sitting in the seat he once assumed would be his. Preston gripped the armrest. For the first time in many years, he was not angry. He was ashamed. In first class, gentle afternoon, sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over James. Zoe studied him for a long moment. "You know what the most important thing about all this is?" she asked. "What is it?" James replied without looking over. "You made this entire plane see the truth they always tried to ignore. Not everyone in a suit receives respect, and not everyone who is dismissed is powerless." James gave the faintest smile. Then, in a voice deep and steady as stone, he said, "We are not done. Zoe, this flight is only the beginning." The seatbelt sign illuminated. The new captain, Alicia Rodriguez, announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for descent." Zoe turned to James. "Ready?" James adjusted his tie, his gaze sharp as an arrow aimed forward. Ready to begin the campaign. As the aircraft shuddered lightly, preparing to land in San Francisco, James understood that once he stepped out of that cabin door, nothing would remain the same. Not for the airline, not for the aviation industry, not for anyone who had ever believed they could block a man's path simply because of the color of his skin. A new chapter was opening, and James Washington was the one holding the pen. The wheels touched the runway in San Francisco, with a softness like a whispered breath, yet for those who had just witnessed a storm at 36,000 feet, that gentle landing felt like a declaration that Phase 2 of the story had begun. James Washington opened his eyes as the aircraft shuddered slightly, sunlight tilting through the window and painting his face in a pale gold. Zoe glanced at him, sensing that something significant would happen the moment they stepped out of this cabin. Ready for what comes next, she asked, her voice soft but sharp, like the edge of a blade. James exhaled slowly. "I have been waiting for a day like this." Zoe tilted her head. A day like what? James stared straight ahead, his eyes deep and unwavering. A day when silence is no longer an option. The familiar ding sounded and the seatbelt sign went off, but no one stood up. The entire first-class cabin seemed to wait, watching James, as if he was no longer just a passenger, but the central figure in a live, unfolding drama. Even passengers in economy paused mid-motion, looking upward, having caught whispers of a chief executive officer, a confrontation, a clash of power. Marcus, the new cabin lead, approached James. "Mr. Washington, Captain Rodriguez would like to speak with you before you leave the aircraft." Zoe arched a brow. "Here we go." James rose, smoothing his vest. He did not rush. He did not tremble. He walked like a man who understood that every step was a statement. I am not silent anymore. Captain Alicia Rodriguez waited by the cockpit door. Her posture was sharp like a blade, but her eyes burned with a warm fire. "Mr. Washington," she said with a nod, "I want a private word with you." James stepped closer. Zoe stayed a few steps behind, still holding her iPad, as if ready to preserve any truth that mattered. Rodriguez lowered her voice. "What happened today, it is not rare. It is not new. And it does not happen only to you." Her voice did not shake, yet beneath it lay an ocean of things unspoken. James studied her long enough to see everything hiding behind her rank and the knowledge buried in her eyes. Rodriguez took a breath. "In this airline, we have a small group pilots and flight attendants of all backgrounds. We have pushed for reform many times. Every time we were blocked," James asked quietly. Blocked by whom Rodriguez gave a dry, tired smile. "People like Bennett today. People who believe they are untouchable." A heavy silence swept through the cabin. Zoe muttered, "Today they chose the wrong target." Rodriguez nodded. "Today you did not just stand up for yourself. You opened a door we have been trying to push for years." James frowned. A door. Rodriguez pulled out her phone and opened a chat group. On the screen were more than 150 members. The name of the group, Equality, in the Sky Internal Task Force. "We have been waiting for the right moment," she said. "And you created it. By now, passengers were lining up to deplane, but no one walked straight out. Each person passing James paused, touched his arm lightly, and whispered something. "Thank you. You did what no one dared. We will remember this. My husband was removed from a plane for raising his voice slightly. I was once treated like a stowaway. Fragments of lives, old wounds, years of quiet humiliation poured out like a dam finally breaking." Zoe stood beside him, her face composed, but her eyes shining. "See," she said softly, "it was never just you. It is never just you." James tightened his grip on his briefcase, as if keeping himself from cracking open. When the cabin nearly emptied, a figure waited at the jet bridge, the walkway connecting the aircraft to the terminal. Senator William Preston. Zoe nudged James's elbow. "Round 2. James stepped onto the metal walkway, each footstep echoing against the cold steel. Preston stood straight hands, clasped his face, slightly flushed, but stripped of his usual political arrogance. He extended a hand. "Mr. Washington, I need to speak with you." James remained still. Zoe crossed her arms. No one reached for the offered hand. Preston withdrew it, exhaling heavily. "I was wrong. Wrong from the moment I stepped onto that plane." He looked away briefly, as if hiding from himself, then continued. "You were right. This system has been broken for a long time, and people like me let it continue." Zoe's tone was razor-sharp, probably because it never hurt you. Preston froze, but he did not lash out this time. "You are right," he whispered. And today I saw it more clearly than ever. After a long pause, he faced James again. "I want to fix it. If you allow it, I want to work with you." James stared at the man who, only hours earlier, tried to take his seat without hesitation. "Do you want to fix it?" he asked. "Or fix your image?" Preston swallowed. "Both. But the first is real." James studied him for a moment, then said, "I will judge you by actions, not words." Preston nodded firmly. "I will prove it." As they stepped out of the jet bridge, an entire group awaited them. Not the press. Not media. Representatives of the airline, legal human resources, senior management, and a stern-looking woman in a black suit, the chief diversity officer. Harrison rushed forward. "Mr. Washington, we have prepared a temporary conference room in the terminal. The chief executive officer wants your first report." Zoe murmured. "He fears you more than he fears the chairman." James glanced around at the faces filled with caution, unease, and something else beneath it. Expectation. Expectation that he would speak the words they had been too afraid to voice. He nodded. "Lead the way." They entered a small airport conference room, a long wooden table, glass walls overlooking the runway, still warm from aircraft wheels. Harrison opened his laptop. The chief diversity officer sat across from James, hands interlaced. Preston joined quietly in the back, like a student afraid to interrupt. Harrison began, "Mr. Washington, we want you to speak freely. No holding back." James looked around. Zoe placed a hand on the back of his chair, a silent cue. "Speak. Now is the time." James leaned back, exhaled slowly, then began. "I am not going to talk about personal feelings. I am going to talk about the system." The room shifted toward him. What happened today was not because of Meredith or Bennett. It happened because they believed they were allowed to. A few heads nodded gently. Because they believed the senator mattered more than I did. A flash of shame crossed Preston's face. Because they believed a black man in a first-class seat must be questioned. No one denied it. No one dared. James leaned forward. "If your culture allows that to happen, you do not fix a few employees. You fix how the entire organization operates." The chief diversity officer spoke, her voice steady but emotional. "Where do you want us to start?" James opened his briefcase and placed a stack of documents on the table. "Here, a full reform program. Long-term, not for show, not to avoid lawsuits, to repair the foundation." He slid the papers across the table. "Retrain, re-evaluate, change the procedures, update the culture, create anonymous reporting channels, make management accountable." Silence filled the room like a thick blanket. Zoe added, "If you do this right, the world will notice. If you do not," James finished, "I will make sure they notice." It was not a threat. It was a promise. When the meeting ended, Harrison nearly bowed. "We will start immediately. You have my word." James stood, straightened his vest, and replied calmly, "I do not trust words. I trust results." Zoe gathered the documents, and as they stepped out of the room, the afternoon sun cast a golden light across the runway. Zoe turned to James. "You know what I just realized?" James gave a tired smile. "What is that?" Zoe spoke slowly, each word, closing this chapter of the story. "Today they thought they were trying to remove you from your seat, but in reality, you just pulled the entire aviation industry into the biggest reform they have ever faced." James paused, his eyes dark, but shining with steel. "That was not my goal, but if it happens, then let it happen the right way." Zoe nodded. Together they looked out at Flight Mike Hotel, 249 still parked in the golden glow of sunset, like a quiet symbol of the battle just begun. And James knew the fight ahead would be long, but he was ready. Because sometimes, to change the sky, all it takes is one man refusing to give up his seat. A week had passed since the airborne battleground of Flight Mike Hotel 249, yet its aftershocks continued to ripple through the aviation industry like an underground wave. Leaked news passenger audio recordings posted online, anonymous flight attendant blogs, all merging into a rising wind that pushed the story into headlines. But James Washington did not go on television. He did not post online. He made no public statement. His silence was not shyness. It was strategy. Zoe understood better than anyone. She had followed him for 8 years, watching him turn invisible attacks into stepping stones that built TechVision. And this time, she knew he was preparing for something far larger. "Why are you not responding to the press?" Zoe asked, as they walked into the 38-story glass tower that housed TechVision's headquarters in Oakland. James gave a light smile. "Because we are not done speaking. We are still building." Zoe chuckled. "You always play the long game." "The long game is how you beat the system," James replied. The TechVision lobby glowed with bright white light. Employees on both sides bowed their heads slightly as he walked through. They did not do it out of fear, but out of respect, the kind built through years of James protecting them, fighting for them, and placing them above short-term profits. As they walked through the illuminated corridor, Zoe murmured, "News about the airline is spreading everywhere now. Online, in forums, even podcasts. Some people call you a hero. Some say you are chasing publicity." James simply said, "I do not need them to call me anything. I just need them to keep listening." On the 27th floor, the Aurora conference room was lit up. Inside were TechVision's DEI team, human resources, legal and communications, the people who would help James turn the events of Mike Hotel 249 into real reform. When James entered, they all stood up, as if awaiting a general returning from battle. Dr. Amara Okafor, head of DEI, stepped forward first. "James, we drafted a detailed proposal based on the documents you gave Harrison. Do you want the summary version, or the full one?" James removed his coat and placed it on the chair. "Full," he said calmly, though his eyes were sharp as steel. The first slide lit up on the large screen. "Airline Cultural Reform Initiative, ALERI." Zoe raised a brow. "We already have a name." "A name is necessary," Dr. Amara replied, "if we want it to outlive a public relations campaign." The next slide appeared. Objective 1, change how training works. Objective 2, change how reporting works. Objective 3, change accountability. Objective 4, change hiring practices, especially for command-level flight crew. James nodded slowly. "Good. Continue." The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. When it ended, everyone in the room felt as if they had pushed a massive boulder off the path, yet the boulder continued rolling. Zoe stood beside James near the screen as he gathered his materials. "You know," she whispered, "I thought MH249 was just a scandal at first, but now I see clearly it was a catalyst." James smiled. "A catalyst means nothing unless we create the reaction that follows." Zoe leaned on the table. "Still, do you not feel the pressure? Facing the entire aviation industry, almost alone." James shrugged. "I have never been alone." As if the universe heard him, his phone rang. Maxwell Reynolds, the airline's chief executive officer. Zoe's eyes widened. "He is calling before the scheduled meeting." James answered. "Reynolds." The voice on the other end was low, tired, but determined. "James, we have to move quickly. The board wants to meet with you. And there is something else." "What is it?" "The Senate subcommittee is requesting a full report. They want to invite you as an advisor for the upcoming hearing." Zoe's jaw dropped slightly. "You are being called to testify before Congress," James answered softly. "Fine. I will be there." The next day, James flew to Washington, District of Columbia, not for tech vision business, but for something greater to shape the future of American aviation policy. His plane landed at Reagan Airport. The spring breeze drifted through the glass corridor, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of landing aircraft. Zoe walked close beside him. Long day ahead. Ready, James smiled. "Zoe, I have been ready since the moment they asked me to give up my seat." The Capitol building stood like a vast mirror of authority, grand, cold, and filled with stories only insiders truly understood. James passed through security, a badge reading VIP Pass, Special Hearing Guest, clipped to his chest. Zoe followed, documenting everything on her iPad. The Subcommittee on Aviation hearing room was brightly lit, long wooden tables, microphones, leather chairs aligned perfectly. A few journalists were present, even though they were not allowed to film. And at the center row, Senator William Preston was already waiting. Zoe whispered, "He got here early." James replied quietly, "He is trying to fix his mistake." When the hearing began, the committee chair announced, "Today we hear testimony from Mr. James Washington, Chief Executive Officer of TechVision Enterprises, who directly experienced discriminatory treatment on Flight Mike Hotel 249. The cameras turned on. Silence filled the room. James inhaled deeply. Then he began. "I am not here to talk about how I was treated. I am here to speak for the thousands of people who could never sit in this chair to talk about how they were treated." A few staffers lifted their heads. James continued, voice resonant and steady. "I am not the first person asked to leave a first-class seat, but I would like to be the last." Questions followed. James answered them with the calm and sharp logic that had built TechVision into an empire. When the hearing ended, the committee chair delivered a line that made the room tremble. "Mr. Washington, your testimony will shape the new policy direction for the aviation industry." Zoe looked at him, her lips curling slightly. "You just shifted the entire country without breaking a sweat." James replied, "I did sweat. Just on the inside." 2 weeks after the hearing at the airline headquarters, a special meeting convened. James and the TechVision team entered the largest conference room, its glass wall overlooking rows of aircraft waiting along the tarmac. Chief Executive Officer Maxwell Reynolds shook James's hand tightly. "You made us look at ourselves again." James replied, "Looking is the first step. Changing is the important one." Harrison presented the updated reform package: new seating policy, bias-resistant training, anonymous reporting system, internal diversity council, transparent disciplinary procedures, and the James Washington Scholarship for Minorities in Aviation. Zoe choked up when she heard the name. James bowed his head slightly. "There is no need to name it after me," Reynolds cut in. "Yes, there is. Because without you, none of this would exist." The room fell into silence. Not heavy silence, recognizing silence. When the meeting ended, Zoe and James walked down a glass hallway. The afternoon sun streaked through the windows, casting orange rays like spreading flames. Zoe whispered, "Do you see that?" "See what James asked?" She pointed toward the aircraft parking area, where a large group of flight attendants and pilots stood together, holding signs. "Thank you, Mr. Washington. Change begins with courage. You stood for us." James froze. The wind on the runway blew hard, whipping the flag behind them to full mast. A young pilot stepped forward and bowed. "I just received the scholarship. My dream of becoming a pilot finally feels possible. James could not speak for a moment. Finally, he said, I have done my part. Now it is your turn to do yours. The group answered in unison, Yes, sir. Under the blazing red sunset, James understood. The battle had begun with a humiliating moment on flight Mike Hotel 249, but it would end with a new generation rising without the invisible chains of prejudice. Zoe looked at him and smiled. James, that day, they tried to force you out of your seat. Today they handed you the entire sky. James looked upward, breathing slowly and deeply. Not pride, not gloating, only belief. Belief that change was real, and that it all began with one man refusing to stand up when the world insisted he should yield. A month had passed since the day James Washington stepped off flight Mike Hotel 249 after the storm of discrimination, yet the impact of that moment still pulsed through the aviation industry like an electric current. News articles, anonymous blogs, passenger videos, expert analyses, all blended together into an invisible pressure that every airline felt, even if none of them said it aloud. What was fascinating was that in the center of all the public attention, James remained silent. No interviews, no posts, no statements. Yet that silence only made his name appear more frequently than those who tried desperately to speak. Zoe understood the strategy clearly. Silence was not retreat. Silence was giving the world time to listen more deeply. That morning inside the 38th floor office of Tech Vision, with glass walls overlooking the misty San Francisco Bay, James stood quietly watching streaks of light stretching across the water like the horizon had been cut open by a blade of metal. Zoe walked in, holding a thick stack of documents, observing him as though trying to hear the rhythm of his thoughts. News about you is spreading fast, she said, with a mix of sigh and amusement. They are calling it the Washington effect. James frowned immediately. I do not like that name. Zoe laughed. You did not choose it. The world chose it for you. James turned toward her, his gaze deep, like a lake disturbed by wind. I do not need the world's praise. I need their attention. Zoe nodded. She knew he meant it. They headed down to the Aurora conference room on the 27th floor, where the full DEI team, human resources, legal and communications were already waiting. When James entered, everyone stood, not because of hierarchy, but because this meeting marked the next step in the battle he had ignited. Dr. Amara Okafor brought up the first slide. Phase 2, Implementation Mapping. Zoe let out a low whistle, a proud and impressed sound. So we are moving from concepts to actually building it. Amara nodded, her eyes determined. No more theoretical frameworks. We start laying the foundation. James said nothing, only giving a small nod, yet the weight of it was felt by everyone in the room. They began presenting each component training programs built on immersive simulations, anonymous reporting with encrypted tech vision systems, multi-level accountability structures, revised hiring protocols with new ethical standards for command positions. Each item landed like a wave, washing away old cultural debris the aviation industry had allowed to accumulate for far too long. When the final slide was presented, James stood one hand on the table. Good. But something is missing. The room fell silent. Zoe looked at him, then spoke the unspoken. Missing the people. James nodded, his gaze sharp as a freshly honed blade. I will not rebuild a system only to hand it back to people like Bennett and Meredith. The air thickened, A few people swallowed hard, but everyone knew he was right. If you do not fix the people in power, James continued, any change is just paint. The meeting ended with the unmistakable feeling that they had just drafted the blueprint of a quiet revolution. On their way back to his office, Zoe asked, "You really do not feel the pressure?" James answered softly, "I have never walked alone." As if to prove it, his phone rang. "Maxwell Reynolds." James answered. "Reynolds?" The voice on the other end was heavy, but committed. "James, the board wants to meet with you as soon as possible, and there is a request from the Senate." James narrowed his eyes. "What request?" Reynolds exhaled. "They want you to serve as an advisor for the upcoming aviation reform hearing." Zoe's eyes widened. "Congress actually invited you," James said. "Only I will go." 2 days later, James and Zoe were in Washington, District of Columbia, walking into the Capitol with VIP badges. The hearing did not feel like a discussion. It felt like a vow. When the committee chair introduced him, the room fell silent like a ceremony, and James's opening line made pens stop mid-stroke. "I did not come here to tell my story. I came here to tell the stories of those who cannot sit in this chair." 30 minutes later, when James stated I was not the first person asked to give up my seat. "But I hope I will be the last," someone in the room quietly wiped away tears. The hearing ended with a statement that shook the chamber. "Mr. Washington, your testimony will be the foundation of new policy." Zoe leaned close to him and whispered, "You just changed the whole nation without raising your voice." James replied, "I raised it. On the inside." 2 weeks later, during a video meeting with Chief Executive Officer Reynolds, the Executive Board and Senator Preston Reynolds made a proposal that nearly made Zoe drop her iPad. "James, we want to appoint you as strategic advisor for aviation culture and equity for the entire corporation." And when James responded with 3 conditions, transparency, publicity, and no budget cuts allowed, both Reynolds and Preston nodded instantly. They knew refusing meant going against public opinion and against James himself. After the call ended, James stood by the office window overlooking the city, its streetlights blinking to life, like millions of eyes turning toward the sky. Zoe approached her voice, low but fierce. "Do you know what you just did?" James stayed silent for a long moment. On the horizon, streaks of purple clouds gathered like the sign of a new storm. He finally said, "I just opened a door. Now we see who dares walk through it." Zoe smiled. "They will walk through. Because you just proved something." James did not look at her, but he listened. "That sometimes," she said, her voice gentle but steel-edged, "to change the sky, all it takes is one person refusing to stand up from his seat." James closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, then opened them with the steel of someone who had chosen a path with no return. He said only one sentence, light as wind, yet heavy as a declaration. "Zoe, prepare the campaign." And from that moment, the silent revolution of the skies officially began. On a June morning, when the first sunlight still hovered lazily over the surface of the San Francisco Bay, James Washington stepped out of the car in front of the headquarters of Horizon Air, the largest partner within the Global Airlines Partners Alliance. The glass door reflected his figure like that of a warrior emerging from his command post, dark suit eyes, sharp as a blade, and the quiet authority of a man carrying an entire national aviation reform on his shoulders. Zoe walked a few steps behind, holding her iPad, her quick footsteps contrasting with the tension on her face. She knew today's meeting would not resemble any other. Horizon Air sent an urgent email at midnight, she whispered as they entered the main lobby. Something big is definitely happening, James replied without turning backward. I need them to be honest. The Horizon Air lobby stretched wide, like a futuristic museum, glass walls reaching the ceiling, polished granite floors, LED screens, looping images of aircraft taking off, as if flaunting the power and glamour of the industry. But beneath all that shimmer, James sensed something else. A fracture. A crack in the system he had been peeling back layer by layer. They were escorted into the Excelsior meeting room, Horizon Air's largest boardroom. When the door opened, the entire executive leadership was already present. Chief Executive Officer William Carter, Chief Operating Officer, Chief Pilot, Human Resources Director, Head of Cabin Services, and nearly 10 other senior managers. All of them rose when James entered. But unlike gestures of formality, this one was laced with tension, worry, and the gravity of something they could no longer hide. James rested a hand on the chair at the head of the table. I want to hear why you called an emergency meeting. Chief Executive Officer Carter inhaled slowly, his eyes tight with pressure as he looked at James. James, we have a problem. Zoe stood behind him, documenting every word, every expression. Carter continued. In the past 3 weeks, we have received nearly 40 internal reports related to discrimination by flight crews and airport management. James narrowed his eyes. 40. What was the previous average? The Human Resources Director swallowed. Before this, around 3 per year. Zoe exhaled sharply, loud enough that half the room turned toward her. 3 per year. That means people were too afraid to report. Carter nodded. We believe so. James crossed his arms, his voice dropping into a deeper register. And the real reason you want me here today. The Chief Operating Officer broke in with a voice trembling like someone struggling to stay above water. James, the old system is collapsing. People are speaking up. People are submitting reports. People are mentioning your name. Carter inhaled again, the worry on his face, more visible now. And the board thinks you triggered an effect that is too big, too fast. James stared at him, sharp enough to cut through every layer of defense in the man's head. And that is a problem. Carter lowered his gaze. No, not a problem, but it is disruptive. The room fell silent. James stepped forward, placing both hands on the walnut table. His voice was low but powerful enough that everyone felt forced to meet his eyes. Disruption is good. Disruption means the system has finally been shaken. He tilted his head slightly, his tone tightening. And if a system trembles because of a small truth, then the fault is not the truth. The fault is the system. No one dared disagree. Chief Executive Officer Carter turned toward his team voice, small, as if admitting something long overdue. That is exactly why you are here today. At that moment, the head of cabin services, a thin woman with grey blonde hair and a face that looked older than her years, hesitantly stood up. James, there is something else. James gestured for her to continue. The junior flight attendants, they are asking to meet you. Many say you gave them the courage to file a report for the first time in their lives. The room went silent for a beat. Then Zoe nearly laughed in disbelief. They want to meet you to thank you. The head of cabin services shook her head. Not just to thank him. They want to speak further. Her voice trembled. They believe you will listen to them more than their own managers. James took a deep breath, not out of exhaustion, but to keep his emotions from cracking through the calm he wore like armor. Arrange it, I will meet them now." Carter shot up from his seat. "James, you want to meet them directly here?" "Here." James confirmed, or anywhere they feel safe. Minutes later, a group of young flight attendants, around 10 of them, stepped into the room. They stood close together, like a small battalion pushed into a corner for far too long. Leading them was a young Asian woman with tired, reddened eyes. "Mr. Washington," she spoke so softly that James had to step closer. "We have wanted to say this for a long time." James did not sit. He stood facing them, meeting each pair of eyes one by one, silently assuring them, "I am listening." She inhaled. "We were threatened when we tried to report discrimination. They told us doing that was disrupting internal harmony." A young man spoke next. Some were reassigned. Some were given poor evaluations. Some were suspended. A black flight attendant added with a trembling voice, "We were scared. But after that day, after what happened to you, people started to believe change might be possible." A long silence spread through the room. Zoe gripped her iPad tightly. Carter exhaled heavily. The entire space seemed frozen under the weight of truth. James stepped closer, close enough for them to feel the strength in his voice. "None of you deserve that. No one should be threatened for doing the right thing." The young woman's tears finally spilled. A single drop hit the stone floor with the sound of something cracking open after too much pressure. James spoke slowly, each word carving itself into the air. "I promise you this ends here." No one moved, but everyone felt the pressure inside the room shift like an aircraft suddenly changing altitude. At that moment, Chief Executive Officer Carter stood up, his voice unsteady but resolute. "James, help us." "Not as an advisor anymore." James raised a brow. "What do you mean?" Carter swallowed, then spoke the words no one in the room had dared imagine. "We want to appoint you as Chief Cultural Transformation Officer for the entire Global Airlines Partners Alliance." Zoe dropped her stylus onto the floor. Several executives widened their eyes. Some exhaled with relief, as if someone had finally spoken the truth they had been afraid to say. James didn't move. A heartbeat passed, and in that single beat, he saw the future. A future where he would shoulder even more weight. A future where he would battle people who didn't want change. A future where his personal wounds would need to become fuel for millions. And finally, he spoke his voice, deep and calm like the ocean's surface, yet powerful as the currents beneath. "I accept. But on one condition." Carter leaned in quickly. What condition? James looked straight at him. "This is not a ceremonial role. This is a role of action. I will have veto power over all cultural policies that do not align." The room erupted in silent shock. Carter held James's gaze for a long moment, then finally nodded like a man accepting a truth he had been waiting for. "Agreed." James delivered the final line, the one that closed the past and opened a new doorway for an entire industry. "Then from today forward, we begin rewriting the rules of the sky." The next day, when the announcement appointing James Washington as Chief Cultural Transformation Officer reached the internal inboxes of the entire Global Airlines Partners Alliance, the system nearly overloaded. More than 300,000 employees opened the email at the same moment. Some cried during their breaks. Some sat in silence, unable to believe that a passenger once ordered to give up his first-class seat was now the man empowered to rewrite the culture of an entire industry. Others whispered in fear, and those who had abused their authority could no longer sit still. But James didn't concern himself with the chaos. He sat in his 38th floor office, hands resting before the screen, watching hundreds of new emails arrive at a pace of several per second. Some messages were pages long, describing every discriminatory moment the sender had endured. Some contained only one line, yet pierced straight into his chest. "Finally, someone sees us." Zoe sat across from him, reading each response, each story, each plea, as if every sentence ended with an invisible exclamation mark. "James," she said, her voice losing the sharp edge she usually carried. "I think we just touched something far bigger than we ever imagined." James did not look away from the screen. His gaze was deep as a lake. Zoe, a system does not change because of a title. It changes when the people inside it begin to believe they deserve better. Zoe nodded, though she knew he was holding down more emotion than his words showed. In all her years working beside him, she had never seen James look this exhausted, not from pressure but from years of swallowing injustice in silence. But today he no longer had to swallow anything. He rose, took a long breath, and said, "They want reform. I will show them what real reform looks like." That afternoon, James held his first virtual meeting with the senior leadership teams of the entire airline alliance. More than 80 squares lit up on the screen, each square showing a different face, tense, worried, arrogant, expectant, and some trying desperately to appear unfazed. But when James's camera went live, silence swept across the meeting like a curtain falling. James looked at each face, not to judge them, but to let them know he saw them not through power, but through responsibility. He opened without any polite preamble. "I am not here to be a symbol. I am not here to become a media story." He paused just long enough for every person there to feel the weight of his voice. "I am here because tens of thousands of people have been pushed into silence." The atmosphere shifted instantly. A few executives lowered their heads. Some swallowed hard, confronted by the truth they had ignored for years. James continued. "What happened on Mike Hotel 249 was not an exception. It was the norm, and I do not accept that norm." A chief operating officer from a partner airline cut in. His voice strained Mr. Washington. "You must understand that we are doing our absolute best," James interrupted immediately. "You are not doing your absolute best. If you were, I would not have been asked to leave my seat. Your employees would not be threatened for trying to report misconduct, and we would not be sitting here discussing reform." The COO's camera went silent, not from technical issues, but because he no longer dared respond. James turned slightly and picked up the stack of documents on his desk. "Today we begin." Zoe scanned the grid of faces and knew that this moment would be remembered in the internal history of the alliance. James spoke clearly, starting today, all flights under Global Airlines. Partners will begin implementing the new cultural code built by my team and me. He paused to gauge reaction. As expected, several executives tensed. One even protested. "But you do not understand the complexity of coordinating an entire industry." Zoe tightened her grip on her stylus, ready for James's counterstrike. And he did not disappoint. "I understand it very well," James said, his voice dropping low enough that even breathing seemed to stop. "Because I once had to coordinate a company from nothing into a $350 million enterprise. And I know exactly where a system breaks before it admits it is failing." The executive fell silent. James continued with controlled, icy calm. I am not asking for what is easy. I am asking for what is necessary. He then introduced the 3 foundational pillars of Phase 1 of the Reform 1. The Transparency Protocol, absolute transparency in all processes. 2. The Bias Response Unit, an independent unit dedicated to addressing bias. 3. The Flight Equity Audit, fairness audits, applied to every flight. When the final slide appeared, Zoe could not speak for several moments. She still could not believe James had built what major corporations needed, decades just to conceptualize. But James was not finished. His final sentence froze the entire virtual room. "And I want the first report in 2 weeks." The COO almost shot out of his chair. 2 weeks, that would take at least 6 months. James cut him off again, this time even colder. If you need 6 months, that means in the next 6 months, another 50 people will face discrimination with no record of it. And that is something we will never allow again. The meeting lasted more than 2 hours. When it ended, James leaned back, his shoulders dropping slightly from fatigue, but his eyes still burning with determination. Zoe sat in front of him, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. You just forced 80 people to confront the truth they avoided their entire careers. Do you know what you just did? James closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, steady and resolute. I am straightening what should have been straight from the beginning. At that moment, Zoe's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, then lifted her head, shocked. "James, you should see this." She held the screen toward him. It was a passenger video released that morning, an audio clip recorded on Mike Hotel 249. James's calm voice saying, "I am not giving up my seat. Not because I am important, but because the principle is important." The video had reached 4.2 million views in 6 hours. Beneath it were thousands of comments. This man changed the story. Finally, someone with power did not stay silent. My dad cried, watching this. He stood for millions without raising his voice. Zoe covered her mouth, overwhelmed. James watched for a moment, then said simply, "Zoe, turn it off." Why, she asked. "Because we have more work to do than watching videos." But she looked at him and understood. He did not turn it off because he did not care. He turned it off because if he watched too long, he would remember the pain that forced him to rise. And he could not afford vulnerability now. He had to keep moving. Zoe whispered, "They once tried to force you out of your seat. Today they are asking you to sit in the most powerful seat they have." James looked at her, his eyes dimming for a moment, before hardening again. "Then let us see from this seat how many others we can help stand up." And from that moment on, reform was no longer a task. It became a vow. 6 weeks after James Washington officially assumed the role of Chief Cultural Transformation Officer for the entire airline alliance, something no one had predicted began to happen. Change did not come only from high-level leadership meetings, revised policies, or spreadsheets full of numbers. It came from the awakening of frontline workers, from people who had endured, who had stayed silent, who had once believed their voices were worth less than the badge pinned on a manager's chest. The emails arriving in James's office didn't slow down, they multiplied. But this time, they were different. They were not filled with despair. They were filled with hope. "Mr. Washington, for the first time in 12 years, I feel seen. I submitted 2 reports, and both were addressed within 24 hours. That has never happened before. I used to think aviation would never change. But maybe I was wrong. Every line felt like a thread, pulling at James's heart, weighing it down, yet warming it all at once. Every night Zoe sat beside him as the office went quiet, with only the hum of the air purifier and the reflection of streetlights shimmering against the glass. She read each email, each confession, each plea, sometimes lifting a hand to her neck as if easing the invisible pressure carried by these stories. "James," she said, eyes fixed on the screen, "this is more than reform. This is resurrection." James did not answer immediately. He stared out at the city, where the lights of passing cars looked like patient sparks inching through the night. "Zoe," he said slowly, "each of these people carries wounds this system gave them long ago. I cannot heal every wound. But if I can make the system stop creating new ones, that is enough to keep me going." The next day, James attended one of the most important meetings since his appointment, the first internal evaluation of the flight equity audit, the fairness inspection, applied to every flight. The meeting was held at the central headquarters of Global Airlines Partners in Chicago. When James and Zoe entered the building, it felt like stepping into the command center of an army preparing for a major campaign. A red electronic display flashed on the wall, "Internal Culture Review Confidential." In the large conference hall, nearly 70 people were already seated: managers, lead, cabin crew, training directors, pilot representatives, flight attendant representatives, all present. When James entered, the entire room rose. Not out of protocol. They stood as if something momentous had walked in with him. He motioned for them to sit. His voice carried across the room like a deep bass note filling a chamber. "Today we are not analyzing numbers. We are analyzing people." A quiet tremor passed through the hall. Zoe opened the binder, but James raised a hand for her to stop. He looked directly at the audit team. "I want to hear what you saw. Not what you think I want to hear." The head of audit, a brown-skinned woman, with the sharp, precise expression of someone who had spent years battling broken systems, stood. "Mr. Washington, in the past 6 weeks, we conducted random checks on 128 flights." Zoe took notes, quickly, eyes widening. "And the results?" James asked. The woman inhaled. "There is progress," she said, "but also darkness." The room fell silent. She pulled up the first slide. 43 instances of bias detected, 31 incidents of unprofessional conduct, 16 cases of mild discrimination, and she paused for more than a second. 4 severe violations. The air turned cold. Zoe whispered, "Still more severe cases." The audit head continued, slow but fierce. And what shocked us most, all 4 severe cases involved employees who had been warned repeatedly but never disciplined. James closed his eyes briefly, then asked names. The room jolted. The chief operating officer panicked James. "Perhaps we should not." James opened his eyes, gaze so sharp that the COO froze mid-sentence. "We will call things by their names, and we will fix the right people." The audit lead listed every name, every position, every action. Her voice did not tremble. But those listening did. A senior manager stood up nervously. "But if we discipline them publicly, the media will." James cut him off with a line that made the entire room shiver. "If you fear the media, that means you fear the truth." Zoe looked at him, her eyes gleaming. This was why people called him the silent storm. Calm on the surface, lightning underneath. The meeting continued, assigning accountability. Some were placed under investigation, some suspended, some reassigned, all according to the system James himself designed. But before closing, James announced something no one was prepared to hear. Starting next month, we will conduct open flight equity audits. The room reacted like it had been struck. The COO jumped to his feet. You mean public audits? Public to all employees, and public quarterly to the public. Several faces went pale. The head of cabin services exhaled, as if freed from years of pressure. Finally, the CEO of a partner airline, a man known for staying quiet and avoiding bold decisions, spoke softly. James, do you realize you are asking for something no airline has done in more than 60 years? James looked at him, voice steady enough to chill the bones. Yes, and because no one has done it, we must be the first. The meeting ended near noon. James stepped into the long hallway, with its deep blue carpet sunlight casting his shadow all the way to the far wall. Zoe walked beside him, silent for a moment. Then she said, "You know that moment you requested public audits?" James lifted a brow. "What about it?" Zoe smiled with pride. "I think that was the moment you stepped onto the real sky of power." James chuckled softly, the rare, warm sound that felt like a brief breath of spring in winter. "Zoe," he said, "gently, real power is not about controlling people. It is about liberating them." As they approached the elevator, a group of flight attendants stepped out of the crew lounge. Seeing James, they stopped startled, then bowed their heads all at once. "Mr. Washington, thank you." James paused, looking at each of them. "Do not thank me. You were the ones who endured." I was only the last one who spoke. A white flight attendant, no older than 25, whispered, voice trembling. But no one ever spoke for us before. James placed a hand on his shoulder, a gentle smile, but a voice hard as steel. "Now someone does." When the elevator doors closed, Zoe looked at him, her emotion unmistakable. "James, you just did something no one in this industry has ever had the courage to do." James stared at his reflection in the glass, and deep in his eyes was the resolve of a man who had once been pushed out of his seat, now resetting the order of the entire sky. "Zoe, this is only the beginning." At that moment, James's phone vibrated. A message from Chief Executive Officer Maxwell Reynolds appeared. "James, we have a major problem. Call me as soon as you see this. It concerns a VIP passenger and a suspended flight crew." Zoe leaned closer, eyes widening. "What now?" James closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, his voice dropping into the calm before the storm. "Zoe, get ready. We have another battle coming." And just as if the sky itself held its breath, waiting for the next chapter, the elevator doors opened. Cold air swept through the hall, carrying the unmistakable sense that the hardest part of the reform had only just begun. The message from Maxwell Reynolds pierced through the tense air like a needle through stretched fabric. James stared at the screen for a few seconds, his gaze sharpening like a blade drawn from its sheath. Zoe stood beside him, her heartbeat loud in her own ears, as she waited for the explosion she knew was coming. "Call him," she said, quietly but firmly. James dialed. After only 3 rings, Reynolds answered immediately, his breath uneven, as if he were walking briskly down a hallway. "James, thank God you called back. We have a very serious problem." "I'm listening," James replied, his voice low and calm enough to make the man on the other end automatically slow down. Reynolds inhaled deeply. There was a new discrimination incident this morning. A severe one. Worse than the one on flight MH249. Zoe widened her eyes. James did not move, which crew Reynolds answered heavily. "The team on flight HA119, Chicago to New York. And James, the victim this time, is someone extremely important. Important in a way that if this blows up, the entire alliance will shake. James tightened his grip on his bag strap. Explain. Reynolds exhaled. The person discriminated against was the daughter of Supreme Court Justice Nathaniel Brooks. The sentence hit the room like metal, crashing onto stone, sharp, loud, and echoing long after. Zoe was genuinely shocked. You mean the Supreme Court won of the 9 yes, Reynolds said. And that's not all. The incident was live-streamed for 3 minutes before they cut it. Some clips have already leaked online. James closed his eyes for 1 second. Not out of fear, out of knowing exactly how powerful this would be. A Supreme Court justice, a symbol of law justice and the highest authority, insulted through his own daughter by the aviation industry itself. This would not just be an internal scandal, it would be political, social, national, and every arrow would point at Global Airlines partners, which meant at James. Where are they now, he asked. The entire crew has been suspended, Reynolds replied. But Justice Brooks wants to speak with the person responsible for cultural reform. That would be me. Yes. He will arrive in Chicago in 2 hours. Do you want me to accompany you? James responded instantly, without hesitation. No. Let me talk to him directly. When the call ended, Zoe looked at James as if trying to read the storm forming inside him. James, this isn't just another discrimination case. This is an earthquake. James looked at her, his eyes darkening, like the ocean thickening before a hurricane. Every earthquake has an epicenter, and sometimes an epicenter is not disaster. It's the beginning of movement. Zoe inhaled. So what's your plan? James replied. To see the truth. They left the Global Airlines partners' headquarters in a black SUV, heading straight for the Internal Investigation Center. On the way, Zoe played the leaked video. James listened to every word, every sound, every trembling breath of the young woman who had been insulted by the lead flight attendant, the very person who should have been her defender. Ma'am, first class is for paying passengers only. Please return to your assigned seat. But I paid for that seat. I don't want you causing problems. Please cooperate. When it ended, James's eyes darkened. Not with anger. With disappointment. The disappointment of someone who had reminded them 1,000 times only to watch them knock the entire room over again. In the investigation room, 3 people were waiting, the head of internal affairs, the deputy director of human resources, and an older woman in a deep blue suit, the crisis communications lead. Their faces were so tense you could almost hear the bones grinding. The head of investigation rose. Mr. Washington, we reviewed the full video. This is severe, but you need to see another clip. He played a second video, one the internet hadn't seen. When it began, Zoe brought a hand to her mouth in shock. It wasn't just the flight attendant insulting the young woman. A pilot, the second officer, stepped out and said the line that froze the entire room. People like you always think you're entitled to something better. A chill crept up James's spine. A line nearly identical to something the first officer on flight MH249 had said. It was not a slip of the tongue. It was cultural. Zoe whispered. What were they thinking, saying that to the daughter of a Supreme Court justice? James didn't look at her. He stared at his reflection on the glossy black table, small but sharp. They were thinking no one was watching. No one was listening. No one would punish them. Then he said the sentence that made everyone in the room freeze. I want to speak to the crew right now. The head of investigation startled. They're in the HR waiting room. But James, they're panicking. Some are crying. Some say they didn't mean James raised his hand. He didn't want excuses. Let me see the truth. Directly. When the HR room door opened, all 8 members of the crew stood immediately, some pale, some pretending to be calm. Only the lead attendant, the one who delivered the first insult, stood upright with chaotic eyes, knowing she had crossed a line she could never uncross. James looked at each of them with a gaze that was neither angry nor hostile, but reflective, like a mirror revealing what they didn't want to see. Who wants to speak first? Silence. Zoe watched their throats swallow air like they were drowning. Finally, the second officer, the man who said the worst line, trembled. I am sorry. I didn't think. James cut in, but his voice didn't rise. It simply grew heavier. You didn't think. That is the problem. The lead attendant burst into tears. Mr. Washington, I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was under pressure. I was tired. James looked at her and placed one sentence on the scale like a judge weighing justice. Pressure is not a permit to diminish another human being. No one dared argue. No one dared look directly at him. James inhaled, then said the words none of them were ready for. You will all be suspended for investigation. But the room held its breath. If you are honest, if you learn from the beginning, if you correct yourselves with action, then I believe human beings can change. Heads lifted, eyes watered, but James continued deeper, sharper. But if anyone believes power is a reason to insult someone else, that person has no place in aviation. They lowered their heads. No one spoke. Then the back door opened. A man stepped inside. Tall, silver hair, a stern face with anger contained behind his eyes. Supreme Court Justice Nathaniel Brooks. Zoe stood up straight as if jolted by electricity. James turned, and for a moment, 2 powerful men looked at each other, not as enemies, but as 2 forces staring at the same darkness in a system they both wanted to fix. Brooks stepped forward, his voice low but ringing like a hammer striking metal. Mr. Washington, I want to hear from your own mouth what will be done. James didn't step back. He stood tall, looking straight into the eyes of one of the most powerful figures in American law. Justice Brooks, James said, I'm not here to justify. I'm here to fix. Fix how Brooks asked. James answered without a second of hesitation. I will do what this industry has never had the courage to do. Make the entire investigation, public mandate, full retraining for the entire crew. And I will personally oversee it. Brooks stepped closer, his voice deep and dangerous. And if you fail, James responded without blinking. Then you can replace me, or drag me into a national hearing. The room froze. Zoe stopped breathing, and then something no one expected happened. Justice Brooks laughed. A small, short sound, but one that belonged to a man who had just found the only person willing to stand at eye level with him. Good, he said, because I didn't come here to destroy a career. I came to see if someone exists who has the spine to fix the disease you pointed directly at. James nodded. I have the spine. Brooks turned to the crew, his gaze slicing through them. And I want to say this to all of you. He paused. You were wrong. But the system that taught you wrong was normal is even worse. No one lifted their head. Brooks looked back at James. Fix it, Washington. I will support you. James nodded. I will. Brooks extended his hand. James took it. A handshake without theatrics, without noise, but deep enough that everyone in the room felt one truth. These 2 men had just begun rewriting the future of American aviation. After he left, Zoe stood still for a long moment, before saying under her breath, "James, do you realize what he asked?" Zoe smiled, her eyes still wet from tension. "You've gone from being the man who was told to give up his seat to the man the Supreme Court is asking to take a bigger one." James exhaled slowly, not tired, not afraid, simply aware of the scale of the path he had stepped onto. He murmured almost to himself, "Zoe, this is no longer about reforming the airline industry." "Then what is it?" James looked at the door Brooks had walked through, and his eyes sharpened, like a blade fully unsheathed. "This is reforming the way a nation behaves." And he knew the next chapter would be far bigger. Looking back at the entire journey of James Washington, one truth becomes unmistakably clear, a truth that those who study organizational culture and power dynamics have always understood meaningful change does not begin with grand speeches or dazzling media campaigns. It begins with small moments, sometimes painful ones, when a person is pushed away from a place they rightfully deserve. But unlike countless individuals who are forced into silence by the system, James chose to rise not through anger, but through intellect calm, and the ability to turn humiliation into leverage, powerful enough to rebuild a structure once considered untouchable. What makes this story remarkable is not that he is a CEO, but that he understands power only has real purpose when it becomes a refuge for those who do not yet have a voice. That choice triggered a chain reaction stretching far beyond a single airplane cabin, far beyond one airline, and even far beyond an entire industry. It became a powerful reminder that in any system lasting change only happens when one person stands firm and says, "Enough." If this story made you think, inspired you, or reminded you that one individual can still change the entire sky, please like the video so more people can witness the strength of such courage. If you want to continue following these journeys of standing up against injustice, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next stories. And before you go, leave a comment with the phrase, "Rise up," 3 simple words that embody the spirit of this story: courage, clarity, and the refusal to bow before injustice.